Bima, our distinguished guest, Rabbi Kanter, the new rabbinic director of the Society for Classical Reform Judaism in the States. Welcome, Rabbi Ken, please.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Let me begin with an apology. Neither my Hebrew nor my Dutch is good enough to give this sermon in the language that most of you perhaps are most familiar with. So I shall try a little bit slower in English, not in any way to be insulting as to your poly-language skills, but to give our friends who are visiting us on this Shabbat maybe another chance to hear a language with which they are less familiar than their own home language. First, let me say what a privilege and honor it is to be here with all of you tonight. For many, many years, my connection with Jerusalem was because of my work at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. My colleague, Dean Kelman, and I worked together as rabbinic directors, and then when she went to the higher stratosphere of being the dean, that I became the associate dean. Kimata dean, but not quite. So let me begin with a story that is not about a synagogue with which you are familiar, but probably is some American synagogue in a big city, with apologies to you New York students. The story is told of a bedraggled and homeless Jewish man who entered into a grand and huge synagogue, simply wanting to daven, to pray. And he walked up to the rabbi, who was standing in the lobby, welcoming congregants, and said to the rabbi that more than anything, he wanted to join that synagogue. Well, not knowing exactly how to respond, the rabbi recommended that perhaps that man should go home that night and consider what synagogue might be the best for him. The next day, that same homeless man returned to the prestigious and exclusive city on a major street. A bit put off, the rabbi asked the man if in fact he had done any thinking over the previous night. Yes, said the homeless man. In fact, God came to me in a dream last night to discuss my choice. Surprised, the rabbi said, I see. And what did God tell you? God asked me, said the man, what shul I wanted to pray in, and I said yours. And God said, oh no, you won't be able to get in there. And when I said why, God replied, I've been trying to get into that shul for years, and even I can't get in. Clearly, that has never been Har-El's story. Everyone has been welcome, and in its more than 60 years, under the leadership of caring and menschlich clergy and leaders like Rabbi Zavidoff and Kanter Cohen, Har-El continues to be a place of welcome for all. My first time here at Har-El was the summer of 1974. When just after graduating Harvard, I began my first year of rabbinical school at the Hebrew Union College, just up the street. Israel had just signed a peace treaty with Jordan after the Yom Kippur War. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister. Teddy Kollek was the Jerusalem mayor. And there was a true sense of optimism in the country. Several of my classmates and I lived in Beit HaStudent, a concrete block building for more traditional Hebrew University students, of which we were not amongst them. And if you don't remember, it was Al Yad Beit HaNasi, right next to the president's home in Rehavia. Every room was on an electric automatic timer, so that on Erev Shabbat, all the lights and the electricity automatically turned off at 10 p.m. And all of them, including the electricity to your radios and other equipment, turned on at 6 a.m. Shabbat morning in time for tefillot. The kitchen of Beit HaStudent was a primitive sort of place where I met my first wonder pot, and where the stove's heating units were removed by 4 p.m. Friday afternoons, so no one could even try to cook on Shabbat. It was where I first learned about the overnight heating tray and experienced those Shabbat delicacies, chulet and shakshuka. It is where my classmates and I joined the other residents of the dormitory to do shmirah, to do guard duty. The only difference was that the Israelis, already experienced in the IDF, were given Uzis. And we, fresh off the plane Americans, were given flashlights, whistles, and asimonim to blind and deafen the mechavlim, and then to use the asimonim for the one payphone in the basement of the building to call for help. We thought we might be able to blind and deafen, but we figured we would use the asimonim to call our mothers. Har-El was such a welcoming place for me, especially this seventh-generation Reformed Jew, who maybe has been Reformed more than anyone in this room, save my distinguished colleague over there who wins the Yichus Prize for her Reformed roots. It was as synagogues are meant to be a place of home for those far away from home, a local family to represent those thousands of miles away, a place where our feelings could flow and where we could come closer to God. And so it is for me an honor and privilege to be here tonight in the first synagogue along with the Merstein Chapel at the Hebrew Union College that I could call home as I began my studies in Jerusalem 45 years ago. And here I am now representing this organization that means so much to those of us who grew up in the Reform movement. And my great-great-great-grandparents would be very thrilled that I would be continuing what was so precious to them when they founded the first synagogue in Chicago in 1848. On this Shabbat Ki Tisa, it is fascinating to me that the last 5 parshiot of the book of Shemot are all focused on the funding, the gathering of materials, the building, and the use of the Mishkan. We read of God's guidance and direction in building this first sanctuary of Israel, how they did it in 3 stages: gathering materials, constructing the frame, and then finally, under the guidance and artistry of Bezalel, the very first artist and craftsman mentioned in Torah, they adorned it with the finest of materials, the best timber, the most precious gold, and red and purple threads. Bezalel was a superb artist, inspired by God and infused by God's Spirit, but even he had to pause the decoration and the adornment of God's house to step back and to see what had been created. Our ancestors ceased the collection of materials on Shabbat, and Rashi reminds us that Shabbat Menucha, Sabbath rest, was more important even than building God's beautiful house. The weekly renewal of the relationship that we have with God is more important than the material splendor of the place in which we worship God. But for us today, whatever we call our home of faith, we do not gather magnificent materials to build our own mishkan, or even a synagogue with all of the modern electrical opportunities given to many synagogues and houses of worship. Our sanctuary is much smaller, much more personal. Our own mikdash me'at, our families. You see, every family, everyone in this room tonight, of whatever tradition and wherever you came before coming here on this Shabbat Eve, every family sanctuary has a framework and its own structure. All are constructed with intricate systems of support and attachment, and every family structure must survive the journeys of family life in the winds of changing roles and growth and development. As our ancestors ceased the collection of precious materials and construction of God's house to renew and enrich their most important relationship, so do we in our own mikdash, our own sanctuary, our own families. The Society for Classic Reform Judaism has treasured the relationship it has and will continue to have with this congregation, its rabbi, its chazan, and its family. And as we stand here tonight, 60 years after those creative and heroic pioneers that began this congregation, may we together follow God's guide for building, that we and our fellow children of God will always come home to this synagogue, to this mikdash me'at, this most personal sanctuary of our Jewish people, that we will know before whom we stand. On this Shabbat, we can and we do come home again.